Hello and welcome to another video of my ascent to 2400. I have just finished playing in the weekly classical arena. I came 5th, you can see down there, square taker, number 5, 58 points out of, I guess, infinite in terms of hypotheticals, but probably about 100 is the most anyone could reasonably score. The winner is an FM, got 78 points. Did very well. These are rated games, so let's see if my rating went up or down, and I'm going to try to show every single one of the games I played in this arena. So I'll try to spend only a minute or two a game so that this won't be a video lasting 8 hours. Right, the first game, I am playing as black in this time limit, which I believe was 20 minutes plus 30 second increments, but I was berserking every single game. So I actually only had 10 minutes. Showing under there my clock time on the bottom right under the A8 square. So I'm black, Sicilian defense. I'm playing a 1200, so it shouldn't be too difficult for me to win this if the ratings don't lie. I set up a dragon type position, and my opponent plays d4, which is an interesting gambit. I don't think it works. It loses a pawn. Knight b5, attacking it again, and I think possibly d6 is a best move on the board, but I play queen b6 to hold onto the pawn. c3 is played, and I have no issue taking it. White does not take back. They do take back, sorry. White does take back. Then I kick the knight. I don't want to allow knight c7 check, so if my queen's kicked away, I want to first have the knight moving. Bishop e3 is chosen. Now I could do bishop e3's response is to go queen d8 after bishop e3. Queen d8 solid, going back, but instead I go queen a5 to target the c3 pawn and line up with their king. Their knight has to move, upon which knight takes pawn, queen takes pawn after their knight move. And my knight's attacking d4, my queen's attacking c4, I'm checking them. Their best move is to move their knight, I think, but then this knight drops on d4, so they're losing a piece, I think, no matter what. They played king f1, and I took the bishop with check, and I think they possibly did a mouse slip here, meaning to do queen e2, but instead queen d3 was the move that appeared on the board, and I took check, upon which they resigned. Good start for me. I don't gain any rating points because of the huge difference in our ratings, but it was nice to start with a win. Again, I berserk, so I get more points by winning this game than if I just played with the regular time control. They did not berserk, so they had double my time at the start. I played in English with a fianchetto system, a bit like my Sicilian dragons, where I attempt to control the light squares in the centre using my g2 bishop, my f1 to g2 bishop. Here, though, I've encountered this line where if I go bishop g2, black strikes very quickly with d5 and then maybe d4. So I play d4 to stop black going d5. And we capture each other. This is perfectly okay for white. Despite having my queen out early, there's no good way for black to attack me. So they play d5. I play bishop to g2. It's almost like an Alapin Sicilian reversed, or a strange version of a Scandinavian where white is the one with their queen out. Bishop e6 was played, and I don't really want to lose my c4 pawn for nothing, but I did like bishop g5 activating my pieces. Pawn takes c4, I can trade queens, put their king in a weird position, and maybe I win back the pawn in the future. Bishop b4 was chosen. I take on d5, so I'm attacking their bishop through a discovered attack. My queen is now not being blocked off by the c4 pawn. Bishop takes check to not lose the bishop. I take back with the queen. And here, I think black made a huge mistake. They play knight takes. I think they were trying to work out what happens if I take their queen, and then they take my queen. And it gets really messy. Can you guess what I played instead, though? Yeah, I can do a kind of double attack with queen takes g7. So I'm attacking their rook, which is attacked. I'm attacking their queen, which is also being hit by the bishop, and at the same time I'm defending the bishop. So I'm doing loads of stuff at the same time, and if black tries to get out with queen to a5, I have the retreating bishop d2, which also would attack their queen. and here they resigned because either their queen or their rook will get taken next turn. 2 wins out of 2. I was feeling very happy here. My first real challenge against an 1800. So there's still a 500 point gap, but these players are not to be messed around with. They can easily perform above their rating. I play a Budapest, where I'm giving up e5 to try and get rapid piece development. And I could take e5 straight away, but I tried transposing into a line they may not know. Bishop c5 attacks f2, so they defend it. Their bishop is now stuck on c1. Now I capture them. And we trade knights, with white going b3 to give their bishop an alternative route to activate. After they do fianchetto and rook e8, white goes bishop d3, and I'm not sure what you would play here. This is possibly the wrong move that I do, but I choose to capture because it gives me the bishop pair. And you may be thinking, what in the world am I doing playing a terrible pawn move? I don't like them normally. a5 looks a bit silly, but the reason I'm doing it is surprisingly to play the rook all the way to either h6 or to g6, which would attack their castled king. And I need to do that before I play pawn d6, letting out the c8 bishop, because pawn d6 would stop the rook swinging across. Because it's very hard to activate that rook for a long time unless you do this plan. So after white castles, rook a6, knight a4 attacking the bishop. I don't want to defend with d6 or play bishop d6 because it would block in the a6 rook. So bishop f8, a very safe move, guarding g7. White threatened the checkmate that wasn't going to happen because of bishop f8. Rook h6. White goes knight c5. I could, of course, blunder horribly. If I capture their knight with the bishop, they do queen takes g7 checkmate. d6 now is good. My rook is in the right place on h6. I now can develop my bishops. And knight e4 is very risky because of my move, queen to h4, attacking h2 and their knight on e4 twice. Very hard for white to defend this. I think possibly f3 might be their best move, getting the knight defended and also giving their king the bolt hole of f2. Instead, white elects to give away their knight, preventing checkmate with h3. We trade, and I have a clear piece up advantage. So I then go rook g6. I'm trying to go bishop takes h6 because the g2 pawn cannot take anything because their king would then be in check from my rook. King h1, the pawn is now no longer pinned. Bishop d7, so I'm improving the bishop. And I don't care about pawns. Bishop c6. I'm lining up with their king now, getting a massive attack after rook takes. And rook h4. White is really in trouble. g2 is attacked twice. My rook's also involved on h4. White tries defending, but then I have a nasty tactic. Bishop takes f3. If white were to take the bishop, their pawn would no longer be guarding h3, and I would have a lawnmower checkmate with the two rooks. Instead, white played an equally, I wouldn't say bad move, but an equally hopeless move. They played rook g1 to defend g2, upon which I can still do rook takes h3. Their g2 pawn is pinned in another way now. The bishop will take the king. So 3 out of 3. Doing very well so far in this tournament. And as you saw, I came 5th out of over 2,000 people. I think it was about 2,500 players. So I had to do quite well. This next game, I'm white, and my opponent plays a kind of Slav in response to my English, which is the line I don't like playing. So I play e3, foregoing the whole fianchetto system. And I just try to get another fianchetto. I like fianchettoing when I'm white. We both set up a pretty solid system where we castle kingside, and all the tension is on the C and D files, with the pawns all being kind of locked up over there. So I want my rooks on C and D. Black usually wants the same sort of thing. And they push c5 to improve their bishop on b7. And here I take, because now I have two central pawns, D and E. They have one on E. But if I trade all the pieces, things are quite difficult for me to win. I did trade knights because I thought that I could play queen b1 and then maybe e4 or d4, trying to strike in the center. Bishop f6. Black is trying to trade everything to get a drawish position. He is a bit lower rated than me, but he's very formidable at nearly 2200. I play d4 now to avoid the trade of bishops. And I thought black may take me, and I would take back with the knight on d4. Instead, queen e7, connecting the rooks. e4, I try shoving. And what this does is after their bishop moves, e5, and their bishop must move to g5 or h4. And I get the bishop pair with knight takes. This isn't maybe the best time to get the bishop pair because they are threatening mate on g2. So again, bishop f1, just like in that earlier game in the Budapest. I defend with my bishop going back to where it started. Black undermines my center by capturing, and I strengthen e5 with taking my bishop. It's not strong enough though, black takes me. My pawn down is not great, but I still have the two bishop advantage. So it's almost like I've kind of got back half a pawn just by having two bishops. Black charges in, knight f3. I quickly play the only legal move. And in queen h4, and I played very dangerously here. I thought I wouldn't get another opportunity. If I play h3, there's all sorts of nasty options that black can have. So I chose to capture their knight. And I do lose the exchange straight back, but I will have two pieces, bishops, for a rook. And these two bishops usually can overpower a rook in the ending. So rook g1. I now try to line up with their g7 pawn in the same way black had done to me a few turns earlier. Queen a1. So with this move I thought it was quite sneaky. I'm threatening g7, but I'm also stopping rook d1, which would trade rooks. And I don't really want to trade rooks. I think my rook and two bishops work better than black's two rooks combined. Here I infiltrate with the queen after g6, which stopped the mate threat. Queen f5, try to trade queens. I'm not yet confident enough I can win, so I first attempt to kind of probe a little by infiltration. Queen c2, and I can't really see a way forwards, so I take a pawn. Rook d1. Black has achieved what they wanted. I have to be very careful not to play something silly. Like if I do rook takes rook, black takes me, I have no way out of check, so I will lose. Queen a6 was a way to not lose instantly. If rook takes rook, king takes rook. If they check me with the queen, I have queen f1. And my two bishops may just about win the game, but still not easy. Bishop f3. I'm attempting to force black to make a decision. Gives my king g2 to run away to in case I ever get checked. So I use that now, king g2. There are no checks for black. And here I can start cleaning up. I've got an extra pawn on the queen side. Time to start using it. Black tries shoving on the king side with annoying moves like g4. I prevent that move and clear the path for my a pawn. Queen g6, a5, h5. Now black's still trying to go g4. I don't really care too much because of a6, g4, and I save the bishop, anchor it to b7 where it's never going to get taken safely. And I've still got a7, a8, queen ready to go. Queen b1, attacking my bishop. I offer the trade of queens now. My two bishops are dominating the rook in the center of the board. Queen e1 is chosen. I don't see a threat, so I keep pushing. Rook d1. I promote to a queen with check. And then I actually was going to trade queens with bishop h6, because if I trade queens and they take a bishop, I'm still winning by so much that it must be winning. But then I saw that I had queen h8. So now I'm looking for mates. And check again, keep checking, going nearer to the king. And I actually missed mate in one here. I thought that couldn't see anything. I have queen f6 mate, but instead I saw a pretty mate. Queen takes g4 check, pawn takes, and then queen h6 mate. So I won the game, a little bit convoluted at the end, but it was a good win against 2100. Now I took a break around now because I was having dinner, so I missed about 2 hours of the tournament. So I have to now berserk every game, just as I've been doing, trying to get a respectable score. I'm black. I'm playing a kind of Sicilian against their e4 and d3, but they bring out their queen really early, and this is a very kind of trollish move. They're being a sort of big troll trying to make me blunder in some way or play too carelessly. I could attack their queen with knight d4, forcing queen d1, which in hindsight may be my best option. But instead I choose to slowly bring out bishops and central pawns and trust that their queen will be weak later. Queen g3 attacks my pawn, and surprisingly I then had to think for a while, because if I castle, white has this this bishop can go to h6, and it would threaten my g7 pawn with queen takes g7 mate, and I might have to play g6 and then lose the rook on f8 if I castled. So I instead played rook g8, bishop f4 was played, bishop c7 is now the threat, winning my queen by trapping it. d6 defended, knight d2, and here I played a bit of a silly move really, g5. I think it might be Kramnik who first popularized this idea of rook g8 and g5, but normally white's castled kingside if black does this. What I saw though is that the pawn is immune, as you'll see. He didn't realize this, and then h6 will win the bishop. White did not want to lose the bishop for nothing, so they instead lost their queen for a rook and a minor piece. After bishop takes bishop, I do have to capture and then lose my rook. So I lost a knight, a bishop, and a rook. He lost a bishop and queen. So I'm ahead. I quickly developed the bishop, trying to be active on a6, like in a Queen's Indian. Then castle to get my king and rook safer and connected and centralized. He did the same. And I played d5 because I thought that opening the center would be good for my queen. There'd be lots of diagonal and open lines for the rook as well. He took, and maybe I should take with the rook instead of the pawn, because I would be attacking d3, but instead I took with the pawn. Rook e1, attacking my queen if they move their bishop. I sidestep, attacking g3. They defend it by pushing onwards. And just to avoid any checks in the future, I play king b8, so their bishop can never check me. Knight b1, which is a bizarre move, so I took the advantage with queen f4 check. I couldn't really see what to do, so I tried breaking with d4, opening up their king's protection. They close up the wall in front of their king, and I try infiltration with knight b4, trying to give my knight something to do. King b1, they're doing what I did, getting out of danger with the king. Rook e8, I'm attempting to open up the position in the center with going on the open file and trying to force white into an error. I thought maybe bishop f1 would be good here, trading rooks, but instead knight h4, and that allows queen f2, which attacks their rook, which is just defended, their bishop, which is not defended enough, and their h4 knight, which is not defended at all. They play my favorite move, knight f5. It is not good enough though. Rook takes bishop. They trade, and by using my pieces and playing actively, white is falling down. Apparently queen takes d3 is a stronger move, which I looked at later on a computer. Instead I take with the knight with check, because I thought it forced their king to b1, then I take on d1 mate. I forgot that my knight, because it's not on b4 anymore, they can play king c2. Check. Then they played king b1, which surprised me, so I can now just take the rook with mate. Next game, I'm white, play d4 for a change. We get a queen's pawn opening, where I play knight d2 to try and get an interesting position. And because they go d5, not going into a King's Indian, I choose to play a collie setup with it's a kind of London system, except the bishop on c1 is not moved outside the pawn chain. It sometimes goes to b2 via b3, and other times white tries to play e4 at the right moment and then move the bishop out. It's a very solid system, but it doesn't really give white any advantage. So the classic break is e4 if you want to attack on the king side. If you want to go queen side for whatever reason, you have to go c4. But you shouldn't usually try to push both pawns, because then d4 becomes weak. So I go e4, kingside attack. Again, I'm berserking in each game, so that means I have to play much faster than the regular classical game, and also try to kind of force the issue so I can go into an ending or get a devastating attack, which is easy to play. So that way my time pressure won't be so bad. Anyway, we trade everything on e4. I have a slight space advantage. Knight c5 attacks my queen, but I go for the pawn. Rook e8 does not quite work. Even though it skewers me, I could then take the rook with check. Their queen would take, my rook would take, their rook would take. We'd both lose a queen and rook each, and I could then prevent anything bad happening by moving out my c1 bishop, and I'd still be a pawn up. Black gives up their dragon bishop. It's a very radical decision. If queen takes pawn, I was going bishop h6, which might end up mating on g7 or taking their rook. Knight d3 was chosen, so I play rook e4, guarding the pawn. Rook e8 now from black. It's kind of a tempo gainer. It's allowed them to have this same position where they've traded everything on e8, but now I have to stop mate on e1, so I play bishop e3, and that gives up b2. So their knight to d3 maneuver does net them the pawn back. Rook c1 is what I played. I thought it was better than just the caveman rook b1, because they just go knight c4. I don't see where I'm making any headway. Rook c1 open file. Smyslov would be happy with this. Rook to the open file. King f1 stops rook e2 at any time. f4, which I did not see at all. It's a very nice move. If bishop takes, knight d3 with a fork on my bishop and rook, if I take on f4. Bishop d2 is my only other move. g5, defending f4, and I now charge up with the rook, trying to win a pawn. Black lets me have it, so after a few seconds of looking to make sure there's no trick, I take a pawn. My rook on the 7th is very good, cutting their king off from ever going up the board and being active. Bishop c3, I'm trying to be on the long diagonal with the bishop. d5, now I've got rook g7 potentially. b4 is a bit annoying, so I could go rook g7, but I didn't like having pieces being attacked. So first I go bishop f6 as a safety move. Rook e8. Again, I nearly played rook g7, but I don't see what's happening after king f8. Black actually has a threat. Knight to d2, and then when my king goes to g1, they then have rook down to e1 mate. So I block their rook's path. I don't yet want to trade rooks with rook e7 because there's a very small chance black might have a drawing line here. I don't want to give them any opportunity. My rook and bishop working really well together. I push a pawn because it's a passer. Knight c6, and I see the opportunity to push it again. If they don't do anything, I'll promote to a queen. If they take my bishop with the rook, I can still promote to a queen with a nice move. So if rook takes bishop, I promote, and their knight will have to take it, and that means their rook on e7 will not be defended by their knight anymore. So I'd win a rook, but lose a bishop and pawn. That should still be enough to win, though, at this level. They go rook b8, which I missed, but luckily I have bishop to d6. They can't take my rook because I take their one, then I promote. So they move the rook. I then defend the pawn and save my rook and attack their knight with rook c7. King f7, they lose their knight because they were trying to get their king over to take that dangerous passed pawn. Rook takes d7, and I can trade rooks. The rest is easy. They played on, but there's not really much interesting to go on here. I just start running around with the bishop, taking all their pawns, making sure there's absolutely no way they will ever get a draw. And my pawn's also fast enough to race up the board and beat the king to the end. My opponent resigned. A 2100 level player that I beat without ever being too much in danger, so I like that game. I then took another break. I decided to watch stuff on YouTube. Then came back. So I'm up against the 1700 again. I've moved down in the listings after maybe about an hour of inactivity. And I play another Sicilian. I seem to be doing well with those, so why change it? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Here I probably should go knight c6, but I tried something interesting. Pawn c4, blocking in their f1 bishop. And I was relying on the fact they were underrated, or lower rated, I should say, at 1760. I was hoping that just good technique would beat them. And I didn't really even pay attention to that knight. I thought, okay, castle. And then after knight c7, I felt like I'd got hit with a thunderbolt. I saw that if rook b8, there's all sorts of knight discoveries attacking the rook. And they might even have a draw with like knight back to b5, have to move the rook back to a8, and then knight back to c7, repeating the position. So I had to think about this. I eventually played knight h5 because despite losing the rook, I get their bishop, and I also will trap their knight on a8. So it's more like 2 pieces for a rook. Bishop e6, attack the knight, there's nowhere to go. I took the knight, and they took on c4, I took back. My 2 bishops, again, I think are worth a rook. They're definitely worth at least a rook, if not more. And so I just activate pieces. Rook d8 was on the open file. Probably e8 was a bit better, actually. Queen b8's eyeing h2, which you'll see comes into play very soon. Bishop d5, I'm eyeing the knight, which is the h2 defender. Then bishop d6, again, h2 is the key area to go, and that forces a concession, a weakness. f3 is now not defended enough, so white has to block the attack on their queen with the knight, otherwise if the queen had moved, their knight would have been lost. And I give up my bishop pair because I want my knight on the board to go to f3. First though, I take their pawn with an attack, hoping to swing my rook across. Queen g4. h5, trying to discourage the queen from staying near their king as a defense. Bishop f3, just getting the bishop out of any danger. Rook d8 does not work, which would fork my king and queen. My knight on c6 is eyeing d8. Rook d7 instead is chosen, and I had a sneaky idea, queen c8. So when their rook moves, which I thought it would have to do, I could then go queen h3 with a mate threat if I can get their queen away. And that's why, after g5, they resign, because their only queen move, which is safe, is queen c4, and there is nothing to stop this. And mate on g2. So it was another successful game. It's a pretty solid win. I didn't play the best there, but it was okay. Now up against a high 1800. Again, I don't underestimate these players, but I was aware that there was about, I think it was about an hour left of the tournament, and I still wasn't in the top, I don't think I was in the top 30. So I tried playing a Grand Prix Sicilian to get a quick win, and they give me the f5 pawn, so I try to hold on to the pawn or to cause havoc. I figure that I can't hold on to it after a while, so I give it back, have a pin, and try to go for a direct attack on their pinned knight. They defend, and I give up my bishop pair in order to give their pawns a bad time. But they take with the bishop, and I then reconsider and think that knight to e5 is a very good piece, so I should leave it there, and instead develop my pieces with queen e2. I missed d4, so now I take their bishop, so that I can play knight to e4, and then I change my mind, so I don't play knight to e4, I play knight to a4. And I figure that the pawn structure that black has with those clump on the D and C files is like in the Nimzo Indian, where it's normally with the colours reversed, where black is the one who's going to have the position I'm going to get, and white is the one with the horrible pawns. But in those positions, the bishop goes to the a6 or a3 square, and then hits the pawn with the bishop, and the knight is also attacking it. Black could take f4, but then it would be very dangerous after knight takes c5, and I'd have a very, very good position. I castle now, so protecting the pawn and getting the king safe. Bishop a3, attacking c5. Queen d5, defending with their bishop and their queen. Rook a e1, connecting all my pieces together, coordinating everything. And black does not try guarding e6, they castle, attempting to survive this attack. I'm happy to trade queens, I've won a pawn. This is good for me. And the rest of their pawns start to drop off. This should be an easy win if I don't mess everything up. They attack f4, so I don't want to lose anything. g3 is a safety move. Again, their pawns can't really be defended. This is the problem with that pawn structure. Unless you have good piece play and activity, or you can repair your pawn structure, in the middle game they can become extremely vulnerable. And here, black tries activating the pieces, it doesn't work. I pin their bishop. Then I attack the bishop and the knight in a fork. Black decides to give the exchange away instead of lose a piece, which does look smart at first. But after they check me, I go king g2, and how are they defending their knight and their bishop? They're in a skewer. They try at one move, rook f5, but then rook d8. I'm now attacking the knight twice. Black chose a desperado move, giving away the knight for the maximum they could get back, which is a pawn. Bishop f6, rook d7, lining up with their king. They now got 2 pawns for the piece, and I decide to swing over my final piece that is not doing anything, improve it, trade some pieces. And what would you play after rook h4? What do you think you would do as white? I did, instead of knight takes, I did rook takes, because there's a thing called Arabian mate, which is when they take back, knight takes, and rook h7 is unstoppable. No way of preventing me doing it in the next move or so, unless black gives up their rook with checks for a couple of turns. And I'll still do Arabian mate with the knight on f6, hitting g8 and h7, and if I get a rook to one of those squares, it's mate. So rook takes pawn, and rook h7 was done. It's a good win. My next game, I do not know the real name of the person who I was playing against. This game started off pretty normally with pawn takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, which is the mainline Sicilian. Bishop e2, d5 is the kind of aggressive critical line. I castle because I'm going to win the pawn back later. And this is just easy for me to play. I like having this kind of position, even in classical chess. Blitz chess is also good, but even classical, it's just a very easy position to play. And black plays the correct move, knight d4, not trying to hold their pawn. And I've got a slight advantage. Apparently knight g3 is a better move than the move I did, but I was going for tricks. With if they take my knight, I go rook d8 check, and I cause problems. King f7, and I do decide to take them because I can break with c4. What I missed was, I thought they were taking me, and then bishop takes or rook d8 looked fun. I missed bishop a6 pinning me. It's a very nice move, and I thought I could do a double pin, a sort of counter pin. Bishop check, and then bishop f3 with a fun idea. I saw that after bishop takes, which they didn't play yet, but then they did play it, I saw that I could go b3, bishop moves, and then I take the pawn. And if they take me back, bishop takes, and I fork their their king and rook with my bishop. And then they played a6, and apparently I shouldn't do this move, but to me it looked very logical. Rook takes bishop. Then when they take me, I get their rook, and I've just won a piece. But what I missed was black had bishop g7, attacking my rook and my bishop at the same time. So they win back their minor piece. I go to the open file and check them. So far this game has been fairly unremarkable. He's played extremely well for someone who's 1700, but it's not a game that is that I'm thinking that he's playing like amazingly well. He could have just had a good run here. Could have just been playing reasonably okay. But in the next few moves, I push my a-pawn, trying to get a passer. I thought here I was definitely better. I take. The rook goes behind my pawn, which is a classical kind of ending setup. I push b6. I think, oh, I'm doing fine here. And he's spending maybe 10 seconds a move, every move, and is playing very reasonably. And I try a trick, rook c7, which... if they take my rook, I take back, and then they can't stop me queening unless they give up their rook. Even then, they can't stop it. And if they don't do anything, which they didn't, I have rook c5, which I thought was winning. If rook takes pawn, I have... What do I have after rook takes pawn? Yeah, I have rook c8 check, which would attack their rook with my bishop. They go check, I defend the bishop, or save it, and to block the check with the king from the king. Bishop check, bishop d4, check, check, and b7. So around here, this is so hard to defend these kind of endings. These are very, very difficult to play. And he was playing unbelievably well that I started to get a bit suspicious. Because, I mean, my moves aren't that, you know, well, maybe they are difficult to see, but not that difficult. My rook was attacked last move, so I played rook h7, and he finds this unbelievable f3 check, which is Incredible move. If pawn takes pawn, there's bishop f4. And my guess is that my best move is b8 queen. And then they can take with their bishop or something. And I have no advantage. They could even take with their rook. So I thought I had to take with the king. Rook d2, and I tried a trick, rook h8. If they take my rook, I then promote to a queen. So instead, I do this. And we now reach a drawn rook and pawn ending. But again, I press on because he's, he's 1700. He might not know how to play these endings very well. So I try king e2. If I'd gone king g4, rook c4 check would have pinned and would have skewered the pawn. So he takes me. Rook b4. h3, which is a very good move. g3, so I'm going to go rook h4 and save it. And he then proceeded to play all these computer moves, which are like absolutely perfectly accurate. So after h2, rook b1, stop h1 queen, you would think he'd play something normal like king to f6, or maybe rook to c2, or rook c4 check, or even h1 queen, and just offer me a draw. But he played h5 check, which is such an unnatural move to play. And the reason for it is it's still a draw, but it's a kind of computer-like... it's apparently the best computer move by like 0.1 or something, because after king takes, he has rook f3, and then I go king g4 and rook takes f2, and things can get complicated. So it took me a while. I saw this and I thought, wow, this is unbelievable as a move. So I offered a draw here, and he didn't take it, which again it arouses a lot of suspicions because he or she is so much lower rated than me, and they would surely see it was a complete draw. So why are they declining? My best guess is that they're hoping I make a mistake so that they take advantage of it. But that isn't psychologically normal. Normally you would take the draw in an instant, especially in this kind of position. So they do this. They keep playing, so I keep playing. I cut their king off on the 6th rank. That prevents any kind of mistake I could make. Rook check, I go up. e4, they're trying to press. King g4, e3, I go down. e2, rook over. And I've managed to win their pawn. But in rook and pawn endings like this, it's a draw. And they see that trading the rooks is technically a draw. Which again, you might think a 1700 might prefer keeping the rooks on, because this is like a Philidor position that they can reach. But instead they did this, and then the rest of it's easy. But I have to admit, my suspicions were aroused, so I did report them, and it turned out that maybe they weren't using a computer, but Lichess thought they were. So I'm not saying they're cheating. I just got suspicious. I wanted to check with Lichess to make sure I wasn't playing someone using computer assistance, and Lichess thought they were. Doesn't mean they did, but Lichess thought they were. So I got my points back. But unfortunately, I lost my winning streak, which affects how many points you score in a tournament. So that really put a damper on things, getting that draw. This next game, I was playing somebody who I think was like number 6 in the tournament, and they're quite high rated. I didn't have much longer to play. There were only about, I think, 30 minutes or 40 minutes left of the tournament. So after about 10 moves, it's a pretty nothing game. He went knight a2 for some bizarre reason. I was supposed to play c4, so I stopped it. And I offered a draw. And then for some reason, I don't know why, maybe someone can explain it. We're both berserk. No, I was berserking, he wasn't. And then when I offered the draw and he took it at move 10, he scored 1 point for the draw and I scored 0. And we were actually not that far apart in points. That actually hurt me quite a bit. Don't know why that happened. But I was hoping just to get a draw with the 2200 and then play someone easier to rack up more points. This next game is the sort of next one that's actually a sort of proper game. It's an English symmetrical, both sides fianchetto. I play e6, kind of Fischer system, and I was actually making a cup of tea around now. So I was looking at the screen every now and then in the background. So there's a few moves where I spend like 2 minutes for no reason, like this one, for example, knight d4. I was just, I think I was just forgetting to look at the screen, and I finally looked and saw. It's like, oh yeah, I've lost 2 minutes, especially when I've berserked and they haven't. So I get my knight to d4. It's on an outpost. It's very useful. I reinforce it, so if they ever take, I'll take back. Rook b1 is attempting to go b4 in the future. So what I do is b6, prevent b4 having any impact on my position. My rook is a little bit weak on a8 to their g2 bishop, but I spot it. So when they attack it with e5, I sidestep. They trade pawns. I've nearly connected rooks. Knight e4 attacks my queen, so I sidestep. a3, trying to go b4, which is a classic English opening at plan. Bishop b7, double fianchetto. This usually at least equalizes for black if I can guess it without blundering my way through and making terrible errors. b4, I capture, they capture back, and I feel like C and D files are best for my rooks, so that's my plan. Put my rooks there, try and improve everything. They still haven't connected rooks or moved their bishop or queen. They play king h1 to stop any checks from bishop d4 or my knight on d4 moving somewhere to check them. Maybe isn't the best move. I try knight to f5, attacking g3. My plan is to remove their knight, which is removing the defender of g3, and then take it. They play king h2, which they could have done in one turn earlier, which would have saved them time. Rook takes c4 is a cunning move. Their d3 pawn can't take it, because I would then take their queen with my other rook. Even though the material would be 2 rooks for a queen and pawn, which is worth about the same, I have a feeling that my queen and pieces can coordinate better than their 2 rooks. They save the queen, lose a pawn. Then they play b5, kind of cramping me, but I still have a kingside attack that I'm going to go for. Queenside, to me, doesn't offer too much, and they have the space on the queen side, so kingside needs to be where I switch my play to. I attack d3 by saving the queen. They defend. h4, trying to disrupt their pawns and remove the guard around the king. Bishop b2 looked very strange because it let me capture. Maybe g4 was stronger, blocking up the h and g files. And then a bunch of minor piece trades are performed. I'm not sure I played this right at all, but it looked like the right kind of plan. Both of us are trading all the minor pieces. My conclusion was that I have 3 pawns surrounding my king. They have 2, but their king has lots of diagonals and files and ranks to be attacked on. But my king has a closed file and rank with the f7 and g6 pawns. So it might be a mystery why I traded queens. The main reason was we're both down to a minute. I was hoping my technique in the ending would be enough to beat 1780. I get a passed pawn on the b file. They have one on the d file, but mine's the outside passer. It's furthest away from the rest of the clump of pawns on the king side. So in a king and pawn ending, I would be better. Wing pawns are generally stronger than central pawns in the ending, but not in the rest of the game. And I also have, again, their king weakness being an issue. So I double up the rooks, try to win a pawn. On h, they've got all their pawns are isolated, so it's hard to defend them. I check, and I can't take on h3 because I'll lose g2. So I swing back with check, hoping they blunder with king to g3. If king to e3, my plan was to go rook on f2 back to b6, and they can't defend h3. Instead they did blunder and play king g3. What do I do next? I have rook on h2 to g2 check, king h4, and then rook takes f4 checkmate. Again, the king safety was the deciding issue. Right, we're into the last few games. There's about maybe 4 left, maybe 5 left. This is maybe the last 20 minutes maybe of the tournament. I know I've said that and probably been totally wrong each time, but I don't think my games are actually lasting that long most of the time. That last one was because I kept on forgetting to look at the screen. But we get a Slav. I play e3 just defending c4. I don't really like the main Slav lines of bishop g5 and the exchange Slavs. Bishop d3, they trade to force my bishop to move twice. They then force my bishop to move a 3rd time. And their pawns are a bit strange on the queen side, but if they can get c5 in, usually black is doing okay. They play e5 instead, and I decide to castle. If they take me, I'll take with the knight, and again, their queenside pawns are a bit vulnerable. They castle. I keep tension. I don't want to take on e5 yet. I feel like I want to let them take on d4. So it's a kind of race to see who captures each other. We both move our A-pawns. I'm trying to undermine the queen side. They Finkesso. Their pawn structure is absolutely horrible, but I have a plan, they have a plan. If they can play c5, again, they'll be okay. I take them. c5 is going to be much more difficult to play now. I think a takes might be the right move, but it looks so unnatural. C takes opens up their bishop, so it's almost like they never have to play c5. What it gives me, though, is a passed pawn on d5, and their bishop is blunted on b7. It's a very hard bishop to activate. My move knight d2 looks at first a bit strange. My idea was to either play f3 as a complete lockdown of my pawns, big chain from g2 to d5. I also have queen f3 going for a kingside attack, and my knight might want to swing to b3 and then a5 or c5. They go bishop to e3. I don't really want to take them, but I don't want them to double my pawns. So queen f3, rook c8, rook to the open file, knight b3, attacking their bishop. They don't let me have the bishop pair for nothing. We both exchange bishops. Queen e7, rook fc1, open file, knight c5, and I'm probably a little bit ahead, but my opponent was #1 in the tournament, so it would have taken me a long time to beat them, and I had no chance coming first. So I thought that when they offered me a draw after the queen trade, it was probably best to take it and then try and rack up more points in the last 20 minutes or so of the tournament. So we took a draw, a reasonable draw. And this next game, I got my wish. I got somebody who's meant to be an easy player to beat for somebody who's over 2200. But then again, some of these players are much better than their rating. And we get a go at Sicilian Grand Prix again. This time I do trade off bishop for knight very early to try and damage their pawn structure. As a general rule, I don't really like trading off my bishops for knights unless I double their pawns or force some kind of concession. And here they're going for a trick. If I take twice on e5 and end up with a knight on e5, can you see what would happen? Well, f takes, d takes, knight takes. They would then have their queen coming to d4 with a check on my king, forking my knight on e5. It's possible that taking them once is best, because then they'd have doubled isolated c-pawns if they had to take that back with the d6 pawn, and then might not taking with the knight. But I chose d3 instead, just to kind of develop the bishop. And again, I should probably take their e5 pawn and then play bishop e3. But instead, I played b3. I didn't really know what to do. I wasn't sure where to put the bishop. Queen c7, queen e1. I was hoping for queen g3 if they castle kingside. They took on f4 and I took back with the bishop. They castled. And possibly queen g3 is good. I didn't like knight h5 with a attack on my queen and bishop, which would trade off a minor piece. I chose to break. And I still got what I wanted. They got doubled isolated pawns. I took my knight. I have loads of knight moves which attack their queen using my f4 bishop. They sidestep, and I went for a cheapo little trick. But it's not really a cheapo. It's a very nice move. Knight d5. Now, if you were black, I hope you would have played a slightly better move than what they did in the game. They took the knight because they thought it was free. But then I captured their queen. I did have a tactic, though. If queen takes queen, I can first take their bishop with check, and then take their queen back, so I win a piece. And if queen d8, the only move to defend, I again have a really sneaky move. Knight takes c6, with a fork on their bishop. It's attacked 3 times. The queen's attacked. And if they take my knight, I can take their bishop with another win of their queen. So that black will lose a piece in this variation. But instead they lost the queen straight away, so it was an easy win. Now this player actually won the tournament. He was playing extremely well, but also very, very fast. I tried playing something that he won't have played against very often, a snake Benoni, where the snake of the f8 bishop runs all the way round to a5 and then tries to trade itself for the white knight. And I was able to do it by doubling their pawns. He was very nice to me. Probably should have played queen c2. I take, and then play d6. The idea of the snake Benoni is that you put all your pawns at black squares, so you want your black squared bishop, your dark squared bishop to be off the board. There are similar ideas to this in the Dutch, where it's pawns on light squares and your black c8 bishop, the light squared bishop, will then run to h5 and take a knight on f3. So it's a kind of mirror image. And I try to control the dark squares with an idea of knight g6 in the future. He makes it very easy for me. He's controlling light squares, I'm going after dark squares. And he's weakened lots and lots of his king side. I felt like he wouldn't castle the king side. I made sure of it now with knight h4. Knight f3 would win their queen, even if they castled. So he now played a stunning castles queen side. And that means my king side attack is no longer, but I can switch the attack very quickly with queen a5. He can't really go for my king side. I've got no weaknesses on the king side. So knight b6, attempting to rush in with knight a4. He plays knight f5, and I could take with my knight, but my c8 bishop isn't doing anything, and it's doubling their pawns, so I am obeying my kind of general principle. And knight f3 is also a nice move in the future. It's one of those kind of pressurizing moves. And if the worst happens, I can play knight g2, and then knight takes bishop. So I won't lose my knight, it won't get trapped. Knight a4, going for a c3. He doesn't defend it. He plays rook g1, which I didn't understand. I thought king c2 was better. But I guess what could happen then is knight f3 anyway. So if king c2, I hadn't really analysed after this, but I looked at knight f3 briefly. I thought this must be winning, because if queen c1, I can do stuff like queen takes c3. And they might just be holding on by the skin of their teeth, but it's very, very hard to play this. I also had knight takes c3, which might be stronger. So this is not looking good for white. Instead, after rook hg1, I played knight f3, queen c2, and I was thinking, do I take the rook or the pawn? And I think I was going to take the, I was possibly just going to take the rook, because it was a much easier move to play. And then I was going to take the pawn on c3 with my queen, which I think would be okay. But I could also take with the knight. I must be fine here. This looks pretty good. And he resigned, so that was easy for me. Going into the last few minutes, this is my last game that counted. Again, I'm up against the 1700, and yet again we get Sicilians. I seem to do well on this chess site in Sicilian. I don't know why. It's possible that my opponents just don't know how to play it as well as I do. Or that because I play a bit unorthodox, it completely throws them and they have no clue what to do. So they're playing a strange system. c3 defending their knight, and bishop d3 guarding e4. Normally white does things like knight c3, which solve both problems. Bishop c2, so they're attempting a different setup. I play d5, which isn't quite as solid as d6, but it does challenge them immediately in the centre. They trade, which is good for me. I strengthen the centre with a pawn. They push e5, and I think I blunder here actually. It might be just the effect of playing for so long. I play knight to e4, and I think they have pawn f3, which would trap my knight. I'd have nowhere to move it. It's possible there's something I'm missing, but I just couldn't see anything. I was going to have to play on a piece down. But instead they played f4, and I broke my rule. I played f6. I'm trying to open up the f-file to stop the castling, which succeeds. They aren't going to castle kingside anytime soon. Queen c7, attacking their weak pawn on e5. They trade, so I have the bishop pair, but a horrible, horrible pawn structure. I'm going to have to use my activity, their lack of king safety, and my bishop pair to try and fight back against my awful pawns. Queen e2. I take on e5, trading off my doubled isolated pawns. And I trade here. Maybe bishop g7's better, but it was a simple move to take. Now they have an isolated pawn. Bishop f5 with a quick tempo gain on their queen. And again, I'm relying on my ending technique to win the game. With the trade and rook b8. They defend, and I slide up with the rook, good rook lift, attacking their weak pawn. Their lack of development has shown to be a problem. And again, rooks on the open file is where they belong. So rook d8, pinning, king c1, rook e2. So this move, I think, is quite annoying. Possibly rook d1 is the best move, but I couldn't see what they do after rook takes g2. Because if they can't move their a1 rook, they can't move the d1 rook because their knight will get taken. They can't move the knight for the reason that I'll be showing in a moment. And if they move a pawn, like I don't know, h4, whoops. I mean, they could play something like h4, but then bishop g4. I'm compelling their rook to move, losing their knight. So it's a horrible position. They played knight c4, and unfortunately rook c2 check, king b1, and then rook takes knight with a discovered check. My rook is immune from capture. So I'm a knight up, totally winning. They resign. So that made me very, very happy. And the final game of the tournament, which was completed after the tournament officially ended, so I got no points for this. If I had done, I'd have come 4th rather than 5th. We got a Caro-Kann. They played bishop g4, and I play a slightly unusual move, d3. And again, I think I'm a bit tired because I blundered yet again. Who can tell me why does knight takes e5 not work? What does black do here if they play well? They have queen a5 with a fork, check on my king and taking my knight on e5, winning a piece. So I saw it now and realised I was losing, but they played queen e7. So I instantly moved the knight out of danger. b4 and I run b5 and I run back. c5, and I then think maybe my knight can use the light squares on b3 and c4. So I play a4, compelling their pawn to move. If they play a6, I'll take it and then take their rook on a8, using a kind of pin. So they play b4, and that gives my knight a square, c4. Now I've got the weak square. My knight can never be taken. It's not a full outpost because it's not in black's half, but it's useful either way. Knight c6, bishop f4. I'm planning knight d6 check. a5, knight d6 check. Queen g4 check. Queen e6. And I could not see a way through. This was a bit frustrating, so I took the queens off. Knight c4, defending the knight from their f8 bishop. Knight f6, bishop e2. My plan is bishop g4 in the future. Rook d8, improving their rook. g4 for me. I'm trying to go g5 and then force their knight away, then go bishop g4. Which is exactly what I do. And I thought here I was mating them with bishop. If they move the knight somewhere, bishop g4 check. It doesn't quite work because they'll have pawn f5 and then run their king to f7. But either way, I'm really, really pleased with the way this position is working out for me. They decided to sack a piece, and I actually checked them first, hoping they were going to resign because there was about a minute left of the tournament clock running down. So I was hoping they'd resign, giving me my last few points. But they resolutely played on. I took en passant. They can't take with the knight, it's check. Then I took the knight. They played d3, and I was obsessed with trying to mate them with only a few seconds left. So I ignored their pawn, which is not something I would normally do. Now they've got counterplay. Their c2 pawn is very annoying. I check them, but nothing works. Their king is somehow safe in the center. So I end up maneuvering my pieces around, trying to win, and when I can tell it isn't going to work, I stay a piece up, and then try to maneuver around, trading pieces, and winning in a simple but safe way. King e2, getting out of any checks on the dark squares. Rook g1, trying to activate the pieces, and then bishop e6, going for the base of their pawn chain on b3. They don't defend with rook b8, so I take. The rest of the game is me mopping up, really. Rook takes b2, rook b1, offering a trade. They decline, so I improve the rook. They save the bishop. Again, I try to attack the king as best I can, but he keeps running away, so I grab a few pawns. c4 is not a dangerous pawn. My bishop's blockading it forever, so I win even more pawns. Now, bishop takes knight is actually a threat, because then my bishop on c2 would not be guarded. So king d2, bishop takes, pawn takes, keeping an eye on my bishop. Rook a3, I take on a5, c3, king d3, and I then am attempting to trade rooks, so my idea is to trap their rook on a3 and force the trade. So the black rook can't really escape off the a file because I always have rook b2, rook b1, etc. So I'm hoping to get the rook off the board, which they allow very easily. Bishop takes, and they resign, but too late for me to gain any points. So hopefully this commentary hasn't been too quick, because I've been trying to get through about, I don't know, a dozen games or so in the space of an hour. I hope you got something from it. That was my weekly classic. First time I've ever played this many games, and I came in 5th, so great. And my final rating after this tournament is, I think, 23-28, and it was, I think, exactly 2300 at the start. So I gained 28 points. Just need to do that another 3 times, and I'll be over 2400. See you in the next video. Bye.